Afghanistan, Brexit, Covid, ABC, series of disasters in terms of the UK interactions, and for the same reason. My name's Mike Cashman. If you find what I'm saying interesting or useful, please subscribe to the channel. The problem in each of these areas is short-term planning by the UK government or lack of long-term planning, and a failure to focus on the eventual outcomes. So in Afghanistan, for example, an outcome we should have been aiming for was that at least all those who had assisted British forces and institutions and their families should be safely evacuated from Afghanistan and given a safe place to live in Britain in return for what they had done for us, and that should be done before there was any danger of their lives being in danger from the likely Taliban takeover. A little bit of background as to why I do go on about outcomes. I worked for many years in international development. If we're talking about improving sanitation in Tigray in Ethiopia, for example, it's one of many projects I was involved with, then it's important to focus on what we're actually looking for, sort of improvements in health in the population. Now, there may be some outputs that are relevant there in terms of, for example, a village being declared ODF, open defecation free. In other words, people are not shitting in the streets. Maybe lots of things that maybe other outputs I'll talk about, maybe lots of things that we can do in order to get there. Build public toilets and provide hand washing facilities. That may involve drilling a borehole to get some water, but that's not enough. There's also education in terms of the importance of hand washing and setting up a maintenance organisation to ensure that the facilities can continue to be maintained. Maybe a very small fee each time to be paid to put into a maintenance fund. And that's what the organisation I was working with, World Vision UK, typically does in order that the improvements are sustainable. But the point is, there's a difference between the outcomes, the improved health of the population, and the activities, whatever they are, drilling a borehole, installing a pump. And in any of the areas that we talked about, or anything where we want to make a significant improvement, it's important to focus on outcomes. I worked for many years in commercial project management, and I worked in international development projects as well. I saw a lot of differences between the two. I'm not saying one was more rigorous overall than the other, but in terms of outcomes, in terms of planning for what ultimately you want to achieve, then I found international development projects were much more rigorous, much more advanced. And it's a shame that we didn't apply that thinking to coronavirus in the UK. You can tell when a politician is talking about what they're doing. You can tell whether they're focused on inputs or outputs. Look at the language that they're using. When somebody's saying, we're working night and day, we're shifting heaven and earth, we're doing everything we can, that's all on activity. If you haven't planned things properly, then there may well be a need for feverish activity. If you talk about your inputs, we're going to have 25,000 contact tracers or 100,000 tests per day. You're not focusing on what it is that you want to achieve. I devised a children's story to assist with critical thinking for my grandchildren love it, and it's called When the Cove Giants Came. I'll put a link to it. But my now 6-year-old granddaughter loves the bit where the wise old wizard says to the goblins and elves and so on, but what is it that you really want? And that's the question, looking at the outcomes. So this government consistently looks at not at what it eventually wants to achieve, but at next week's headlines. Now, who's leading it? Boris Johnson. Peter Oborne wrote an in-depth review of Boris Johnson's approach to his prime ministership. He's got a very interesting chapter that starts with examination of how Boris Johnson was. 15 years ago, Boris Johnson hired him as political correspondent at The Spectator magazine. He was a joy to work with, a fine editor, a loyal colleague with the quickest mind I've ever encountered. Nothing needed explaining twice. While writing this book, I found myself trying to reconcile the person I knew then with the Prime Minister of Britain today. We're talking about two different people. skipping a paragraph, Johnson's Spectator was politically eclectic and omnivorous, so much so that one or two critics said it was hard to discern where the paper stood on any subject. He had a sophisticated understanding of politics, which disdained simple solutions, would have long, lucid discussions of complex issues, either in weekly conference or at the famous Spectator lunches. Boris was sunny, liberal, optimistic. So how did the Johnson of the Spectator turn into today's Prime Minister? So read the book if you want to know Peter Oborne's analysis of that. But what struck me about that was, what did Johnson need to be as editor of The Spectator? He needed to be alert to what was going on now, to think about what headlines would be next week, how people would respond to those. It can be a very short-term focused job. It can be done as a very short-term focused job. What is it you're trying to do? You're trying to sell lots of copies of this week's magazine. You're trying to get a lot of response right now. And is he managing the country in the same way? It seems to me that in most areas, we can go through the alphabet: Afghanistan, Brexit, Covid. What's D? Talk about that in a minute. Education. Justin Greening, on Any Questions this week, was saying, well, what about a long-term plan for education, or social care, or the NHS, I could add. We may not see those, but in all areas, apparently, we see just this short-term planning, except one, and that's D. That's democracy. And possibly another, which is the Tory crony contracting. But let's come back to democracy. There's a consistent move in a particular direction to suppress public protest, even one-person protest, to cripple judicial review, to bring in voter ID, which most independent commentators have described as solving a problem that doesn't exist, but suppress, therefore, the number of people that would be voting. But Johnson has sought to suppress Parliament. Obviously, every party leader expects a degree of loyalty, but he required every candidate to sign up to support his Brexit deal, whatever it was, because it wasn't defined at that point. The cabinet is apparently crippled, according to Dominic Cummings. Now, I don't believe everything Dominic Cummings says, but when he says that the cabinet was effectively powerless, I think that's probably true. It does have the ring of truth. And actually, going back to Tory contracting, the arrangement or the diversion of funds towards Tory supporters is also a subversion of democracy. And indeed, the levelling up funds, being the scandal about Richmond, Rishi Sunak's constituency, being favoured, and Jenrick and his junior minister approving grants to each other's constituencies. There's very strong evidence that funding was to Tory constituencies or marginals where one might assume that a significant slosh of cash from the Tory government might make a difference. So in all of these areas, the Johnson government is seeking to subvert democracy. So I haven't gone into detail on all of them, but you can see that for A, B, C, E, the government's achievements are fatally wounded before they start by the lack of proper focus on outcomes, focus on the long term. But the one area where it seems they are determined to achieve some significant results is in limiting the power of our democracy. If you think that's important, please add your comments below. Do subscribe to the channel, invite me to your meetings. Thank you.